The Illogic of original vinyl only. Why collecting ethics should not govern Northern Soul DJ culture. SC Sales. Abstract. The doctrine of original vinyl only, OVO, has become one of the defining controversies within contemporary Northern Soul. Advocates argue that restricting DJs to original pressings preserves authenticity, honors the dedication of collectors, safeguards the culture's heritage, and discourages the use of bootlegs. This paper argues that, while these concerns deserve respect, they do not justify elevating the standards of record collecting into universal rules governing DJ performance. The central thesis is that OVO rests upon a category mistake. It conflates two distinct activities, collecting and DJing, which pursue different ends and must therefore be evaluated by different standards. Collectors seek rarity, provenance, preservation, and historical significance. DJs seek to communicate music and create memorable experiences on the dance floor. By treating the physical artifact as more important than the musical experience it exists to deliver, the OVO doctrine mistakes the means for the end, historical authenticity for musical authenticity, and ownership for performance. The paper examines the historical development of Northern Soul, arguing that the movement flourished through the wide dissemination of music rather than through exclusivity. It further considers the practical consequences of OVO, including the increasing financial barriers facing younger DJs and the risk of transforming a living musical culture into one centered primarily upon collecting rare artifacts. The ethical argument commonly advanced in support of OVO is also critically examined. While illegal bootlegging is rejected as a violation of copyright, the paper argues that copyright ethics do not support the exclusive use of original pressings. Instead, they support the use of legitimate media, including authorized reissues, licensed represses, and official digital releases. The paper therefore distinguishes originality from legitimacy and contends that these concepts should not be confused. The conclusion reached is not that collectors or original vinyl lack value. On the contrary, collectors are recognized as indispensable custodians of Northern Soul's heritage. Rather, the paper argues that their standards should remain appropriate to collecting rather than becoming binding upon the wider DJ community. Northern Soul is ultimately sustained not by the rarity of its records but by the enduring power of its music, the vitality of its dance floors, and the community that continues to gather around both. Most discussions surrounding original vinyl only, OVO, begin by debating authenticity, rarity, or the ethics of bootlegs. Important though these questions may be, they are not the real issue. At its heart, the OVO debate concerns a far more fundamental question: should the principles that govern collecting also govern DJing? This paper argues that they should not. While collectors and DJs both contribute enormously to the Northern Soul scene, they pursue different ends and therefore ought to be judged by different standards. The collector seeks rarity, provenance, preservation, and historical significance. The DJ seeks to create a memorable musical experience. These activities overlap, but they are not identical. The mistake made by the OVO doctrine is to treat them as though they were. The consequence is a subtle but important philosophical confusion. The physical record becomes elevated above the music it exists to reproduce. Historical authenticity is mistaken for musical authenticity. The means become confused with the end. Once this confusion is accepted, debates naturally shift away from music itself and become centered upon the physical artifact through which the music happens to be delivered. The ethical controversy surrounding bootlegs forms part of this wider confusion. Advocates of OVO frequently argue that rejecting original vinyl encourages unethical behavior because bootlegs deprive artists of royalties. This objection, however, does not establish the OVO principle. It simply introduces a separate debate concerning copyright law. The ethics of illegal pressing and the question of whether DJs should be restricted to original vinyl are related only superficially. They are not logically identical. Indeed, as this paper will argue, a careful examination of copyright and royalties leads not towards OVO, but towards a broader principle: support legitimate media, regardless of whether it is an original pressing, an authorized reissue, or a licensed digital release. None of this should be understood as an attack upon collectors. Quite the opposite. Collectors have preserved vast quantities of music that would otherwise have disappeared forever. Their knowledge, dedication, and perseverance deserve genuine admiration. Without their efforts, much of Northern Soul's recorded heritage might have been lost. The question, however, is not whether collectors deserve respect. The question is whether the principles appropriate to collecting should become universal rules governing every Northern Soul DJ and every Northern Soul event. I believe the answer is no. Most of my published work appears under the name SC Sales and explores philosophy, theology, and questions of mind and meaning. Yet I have always believed that truth is not merely something to be written about, it is something to be lived. For me, that lived truth has found its rhythm in Northern Soul. Since 1973, this music has been part of my life. I have collected records, attended all-nighters, presented radio programs, written about the culture and, above all, danced. I write not as an academic observer looking in from outside, but as someone who has spent more than 5 decades inside the scene. I first discovered Northern Soul at 13 years of age. Wigan Casino had only just opened its doors, the Twisted Will had recently closed, and Blackpool Mecca was helping shape what would become one of Britain's most remarkable musical movements. From the beginning, my passion was simple: find the music, own the music, play the music and dance to the music. Whether that music arrived on an original pressing, a second issue, a legal reissue, a bootleg or even a worn acetate mattered very little to me. The objective was always the same: the music itself. Today I am 66. I cannot dance as long or travel as far as I once could, but every time the needle drops I am transported back to the dance floor. Northern Soul remains part of who I am. It is from that lifelong involvement that I wish to challenge one of the most influential ideas within today's scene, the doctrine commonly known as original vinyl only. 1. Collectors and DJs pursue different ends. Those who advocate OVO generally argue that original records preserve authenticity. They believe OVO rewards decades of dedicated collecting, encourages DJs to discover obscure music rather than relying upon easily available reissues, protects the unique identity of Northern Soul, and prevents every DJ from playing exactly the same records. These are not foolish concerns. Serious collectors have devoted enormous amounts of time, money, and knowledge to preserving music that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Without many of these dedicated individuals, countless records would have been lost to history. Their contribution deserves genuine respect. The question, however, is not whether collectors deserve admiration. The question is whether their collecting principles should become universal rules governing every Northern Soul event. I believe they should not, because collecting and DJing are fundamentally different activities. The collector seeks rarity, provenance, historical significance, and the satisfaction of discovery. The hunt itself becomes part of the enjoyment. The DJ pursues something different. The DJ's purpose is to move a dance floor. These objectives overlap, but they are not identical. A collector may rightly celebrate owning one of only a handful of surviving copies of a record. A dancer, however, cannot dance to rarity. The dancer responds to rhythm, energy, emotion, and sound. When the opening bars of a great record fill the room, nobody's heartbeat changes because of the catalog number etched into the run-out groove. It changes because of the music. For that reason alone, it is irrational to assume that the standards appropriate to collecting should automatically become the standards governing DJ performance. Different purposes require different standards of evaluation. To judge DJs primarily by the provenance of the physical medium rather than by the musical experience they create is to evaluate one activity according to the standards of another. 2. Mistaking the means for the end. This, I believe, is the central philosophical error within the OVO doctrine. It confuses the means with the end. The record is the medium. The music is the message. Vinyl exists to deliver sound. Sound exists to create the shared experience that made Northern Soul famous. Collectors naturally value the physical artifact because it represents history, rarity, and personal achievement. There is nothing wrong with that. Indeed, I share much of that passion myself. But when the physical object becomes more important than the musical experience it exists to deliver, priorities have become inverted. The means have become mistaken for the end. The value of a record ultimately lies not in the paper label at its center, but in the music pressed into its grooves. This distinction becomes clearer when we ask a simple question. If two records reproduce precisely the same recording, what property exists within the original pressing that makes the musical experience itself inherently more authentic? Certainly, Collectors may value originality. Historians may value originality. Archivists may value originality. These are entirely legitimate concerns. But dancers experience sound, not provenance. Authenticity of ownership is not the same thing as authenticity of musical experience. These belong to different categories. To confuse them is to mistake historical value for artistic value. OVO therefore rests upon a subtle category mistake. It assumes that because originality matters within the discipline of collecting, it must also matter equally within the discipline of DJing. That conclusion simply does not follow. Historical authenticity and musical effectiveness are different forms of value. Neither should be denied, but neither should be substituted for the other. 3. How Northern Soul actually grew. History itself illustrates this distinction. Northern Soul did not become a national movement because thousands of young people possessed expensive original pressings. It became a movement because music spread. Records were borrowed. They were taped. They were copied. Bootlegs circulated. Legal reissues introduced new audiences to forgotten recordings. Collectors exchanged discoveries. DJs shared information. Music traveled far beyond the handful of people fortunate enough to own original copies. Far from destroying the scene, this circulation of music built it. Without that continual sharing, many classics would have remained hidden inside private collections. The Northern Soul explosion was driven not by exclusivity but by dissemination. The music reached dancers because people found ways to hear it, copy it, recommend it, and play it. The culture grew because access expanded rather than contracted. This historical reality sits uneasily beside any attempt to present OVO as the defining principle of Northern Soul. There is another practical consideration that history also teaches. Original records exist in fixed numbers. Every year fewer survive. Every year demand increases. The inevitable consequence is rising prices. As prices rise, fewer young DJs can participate. Eventually, entry into DJing becomes determined less by musical knowledge than by financial resources. That is not merely unfortunate, it is unsustainable. A living culture cannot flourish indefinitely if each generation raises the financial barrier facing the next. Northern Soul needs young enthusiasts. It needs new DJs. It needs fresh energy. If participation increasingly depends upon owning records worth many thousands of pounds, the scene inevitably narrows. Economics alone makes that trajectory difficult to escape. The irony is difficult to ignore. A rule originally intended to preserve Northern Soul risks making participation progressively less attainable for those who will inherit its future. Respect for history should never become an obstacle to the continuation of the culture that history records. 4. The practical consequences of OVO. The practical consequences of the OVO philosophy are already visible throughout the Northern Soul scene. Instead of discussing music, people increasingly argue about pressings. Instead of celebrating great DJs, debates become centered upon what sits inside their record boxes. Instead of encouraging newcomers, suspicion too often replaces welcome. Good DJs have found themselves criticized, or even excluded, not because they failed to move a dance floor, but because they failed to satisfy a rule concerning the physical source of the recording. That seems entirely backwards. A DJ should surely be judged first by musical judgment, imagination, programming, timing, reading the room, and the ability to create unforgettable nights. The record collection exists to serve those aims, not replace them. This is not to deny that original vinyl can possess historical, financial, or sentimental value. It plainly can. Nor is it to suggest that collectors should abandon the standards they value. They should not. The problem arises only when standards appropriate to one activity are imposed upon another. Collectors preserve artifacts. DJs create experiences. These are complementary roles, not competing ones. The health of Northern Soul depends upon both. None of this diminishes the importance of serious collectors. Quite the opposite. Collectors preserve history. They rescue forgotten recordings. They document labels, matrix numbers, and pressing variations. They are the custodians of Northern Soul's heritage. That work deserves admiration and gratitude. Likewise, there is nothing wrong with OVO events. If organizers wish to promote evenings devoted exclusively to original vinyl, they are perfectly entitled to do so. Such events celebrate a particular aspect of Northern Soul culture, and many people enjoy them for precisely that reason. The difficulty begins only when one legitimate way of participating in Northern Soul is elevated into the only legitimate way. Collectors should be free to collect. OVO events should be free to exist. But neither should determine who may legitimately DJ across the wider Northern Soul community. The distinction is important because freedom of preference is not the same thing as universal obligation. A collector may quite reasonably prefer to hear only original pressings. An event organizer may choose to advertise an OVO night. Neither preference establishes a moral or cultural rule binding upon everyone else. Once preference becomes doctrine, diversity gives way to orthodoxy. That is rarely healthy for any living culture. 5. A living culture or a museum. Every culture eventually faces a choice. It can remain a living tradition that welcomes new generations, adapts to changing circumstances, and continues to grow. Or it can slowly become a museum dedicated primarily to preserving its own past. Museums matter. History matters. Collectors matter. Without museums, we forget where we came from. Without collectors, much of Northern Soul's history would already have vanished. Every serious enthusiast owes a debt to those who spent decades searching for forgotten records, documenting obscure labels and rescuing music that the commercial industry had long abandoned. Yet museums and living cultures perform different functions. A museum preserves. A culture lives. Northern Soul was never simply about preserving artifacts behind glass. It was built upon crowded dance floors, friendships, excitement, discovery, sweat, and the extraordinary emotional power of forgotten American soul records finding new life in Britain. The records existed to create those moments. Those moments did not exist to serve the records. That distinction lies at the heart of this entire discussion. If the preservation of artifacts becomes more important than the continuation of the culture those artifacts originally sustained, then priorities have become inverted. Historical preservation is an essential servant of a living culture. It should never become its master. This is particularly important for future generations. Every generation inherits a culture rather than creating it from nothing. The question therefore becomes not merely how faithfully we preserve the past, but how effectively we hand that past to those who follow us. If the financial and cultural barriers to participation continue to rise, fewer young enthusiasts will become DJs, fewer collectors will emerge, and fewer dancers will experience the excitement that first inspired earlier generations. No culture can remain healthy if its inheritance becomes progressively inaccessible. The greatest tribute we can pay to the pioneers of Northern Soul is not merely to preserve the records they cherished, but to ensure that the music itself continues to inspire new listeners, new dancers, and new DJs long after today's collectors have gone. 6. The ethical confusion surrounding bootlegs. Having established the distinction between collecting and DJing, we can now return to one of the most common arguments advanced in defense of OVO. It is often claimed that bootlegs are unethical because they deprive artists of royalties, and that this therefore justifies insisting upon original vinyl. At first sight, this appears persuasive. On closer examination, however, it proves to be a different argument altogether. The ethics of illegal pressing and the question of whether DJs should use only original vinyl are not identical questions. One concerns copyright law. The other concerns the appropriate format for DJ performance. Confusing these two issues merely creates further confusion. The argument that bootlegs undermine original releases assumes that bootlegs were pressed at the same time as legitimate issues. In reality, this was almost never the case. With the notable exception of certain labels controlled by organized crime, vividly documented in Tommy James' memoir Me, The Mob, and The Music, bootlegs were typically pressed years after the original records had been deleted, abandoned, or left unavailable. They did not usually compete with legitimate sales. They filled a vacuum created by the industry's own neglect. Indeed, there is considerable historical evidence that a strong bootleg market sometimes alerted record companies to renewed interest in forgotten recordings. Faced with unexpected demand, labels frequently responded by issuing official reissues that did generate royalties for artists and rights holders. Paradoxically, The bootleg market occasionally functioned as an informal indicator of commercial demand. None of this justifies illegal pressing. Producing counterfeit records without permission remains a violation of copyright and should not be defended. But that is not the question before us. The question is whether the existence of bootlegs establishes the necessity of OVO. It does not. The argument simply does not follow. One may consistently condemn illegal bootlegging while also rejecting the claim that only original pressings should be used by DJs. These are entirely compatible positions. Indeed, many opponents of OVO hold precisely that view. They have no desire to use counterfeit records. They simply recognize that authorized reissues, licensed represses, and legitimate digital releases are perfectly lawful ways of bringing great music to new audiences. The ethical debate, therefore, cannot rescue the philosophical argument for OVO. Instead, it points towards a different principle altogether. Support legitimate media. That principle is entirely consistent with respect for artists, respect for copyright, and respect for Northern Soul's future. OVO, by contrast, concerns the age and provenance of the physical artifact rather than the legitimacy of the recording itself. The two principles should not be confused. 7. Royalties, ethics, and the collector's market. The economics of royalties deserve to be understood clearly, because much confusion surrounds this subject. One fact is beyond dispute. The collector's market does not reward artists. Once a record has been sold by the record company, subsequent second-hand sales generate no further royalties for the performer, songwriter, or rights holder. Whether an original pressing changes hands for £50 or £5,000, the artist receives nothing from that transaction. The money circulates entirely within the collector's market. This point is often overlooked. The extraordinary prices paid for rare originals undoubtedly reflect their scarcity and desirability, but they do not constitute continuing support for the musicians who created the recordings. The collector's market is economically disconnected from the royalty system. The reverence shown towards first-issue vinyl is therefore a cultural practice rather than an ethical mechanism for supporting artists. The same principle applies elsewhere. If a radio station broadcasts a song from a bootleg record, the artist is still entitled to performance royalties because those royalties arise from the broadcast itself, not from the physical medium through which the recording was played. The copyright infringement lies in the manufacture of the counterfeit record, not in the fact that sound waves emerge from its grooves. This distinction matters. It demonstrates that the medium and the rights attached to the recording are not identical things. None of this should be misunderstood as an attempt to defend illegal pressing. Counterfeit records remain unlawful because they infringe copyright. That should not be minimized. But neither should it be exaggerated into a claim that every use of a bootleg necessarily deprives artists of income in the simplistic way often suggested. The economic reality is more nuanced. More importantly, none of these considerations establish the OVO principle. Even if every criticism of bootlegging were accepted without qualification, it would still not follow that DJs should be restricted to original pressings. That conclusion simply does not arise from the premises. The ethics of copyright concern legitimate reproduction. OVO concerns historical provenance. These are related questions, but they are not the same question. 8. Legitimate media is not the same as original media. One of the most persistent weaknesses in arguments for OVO is the assumption that anyone who rejects OVO must therefore favor bootlegs. This is demonstrably false. Many DJs oppose OVO precisely because they prefer to use legitimate, licensed, and ethically produced media. They have no interest in counterfeit records. They simply reject the notion that legitimacy depends upon owning an original pressing. This distinction is crucial. A licensed reissue is legitimate. An authorized repress is legitimate. A record company compilation is legitimate. A licensed digital release is legitimate. None of these is an original pressing. Yet each respects copyright, compensates rights holders where appropriate, and preserves the legal rights of creators. OVO, by contrast, is indifferent to these distinctions. Its concern is not legitimacy but originality. The argument therefore rests upon a fundamental conceptual mistake. It treats original format as though it were synonymous with legitimate format. They are not synonymous. An original pressing may be legitimate. A licensed reissue may also be legitimate. An authorized digital release may likewise be legitimate. Conversely, a counterfeit record can imitate an original pressing while remaining entirely illegitimate. Originality and legitimacy belong to different categories. Confusing them obscures rather than clarifies the ethical issues involved. Once these distinctions are recognized, the ethical position becomes remarkably straightforward. If our concern is genuinely the welfare of artists and respect for copyright, then the principle should be simple. Use legitimate media. Avoid counterfeit pressings. Support authorized releases. Respect copyright. That principle is coherent. It protects creators. It encourages lawful participation. It applies consistently regardless of whether the recording happens to be 50 years old or was officially reissued last month. OVO cannot be defended by appealing to copyright ethics because copyright ethics do not privilege original pressings. They privilege legitimate ones. The ethical argument therefore supports authorized media rather than original media. The distinction is decisive. 9. The real issue. Having examined the philosophical, historical, and ethical arguments, the central issue now becomes clear. OVO is not fundamentally a debate about vinyl. Nor is it fundamentally a debate about bootlegs. It is a debate about which values should govern Northern Soul. Should the culture primarily reflect the priorities of collecting? Or should it primarily reflect the purposes for which DJs exist? These are not identical questions. Collectors preserve history. DJs communicate music. Collectors safeguard artifacts. DJs create shared experiences. Dancers respond to rhythm, emotion, and atmosphere rather than catalog numbers or matrix stamps. Each contributes something valuable. Each deserves respect. But one role should not be required to conform to the standards of the other. The OVO doctrine unintentionally reverses the proper order. Instead of treating records as instruments serving the music, it risks treating the music as the justification for the records. The medium gradually overshadows the message. The artifact begins to eclipse the experience. When that happens, Northern Soul risks becoming increasingly preoccupied with possession rather than participation. Yet participation has always been the lifeblood of the scene. The music was discovered because people searched for it. It flourished because people shared it. It survived because people danced to it. Those realities deserve to remain at the center of Northern Soul's identity. The records matter because they carry the music. The music matters because it creates the culture. To reverse that order is to misunderstand what Northern Soul has always been. 10. Conclusion. I have written this paper not as an outsider criticizing Northern Soul, but as someone who has loved it for more than half a century. Since discovering the music in 1973, I have collected records, traveled to all-nighters, danced until dawn, presented radio programs, written about the scene and watched generations of enthusiasts devote themselves to preserving one of Britain's most remarkable musical cultures. Like many of my generation, age has slowed my body, but it has not diminished my affection for the music or my gratitude for the community that grew around it. It is precisely because I value that community that I believe the OVO doctrine deserves careful re-examination. Throughout this paper I have argued that the central error of OVO is not simply historical or practical, but philosophical. It mistakes collecting for DJing. It mistakes historical authenticity for musical authenticity. It mistakes the medium for the message. In doing so, it elevates standards appropriate to one activity into universal rules governing another. Collectors and DJs are allies, not rivals. Each performs a task the other cannot. Collectors preserve the past. DJs keep that past alive in the present. One safeguards the artifacts. The other ensures that those artifacts continue to fulfill the purpose for which they exist. Neither role should be diminished. Neither role should dominate the other. History likewise tells a different story from the one often implied by OVO. Northern Soul did not spread because access to music became increasingly restricted. It spread because music traveled. Collectors discovered records. DJs played them. Friends copied them. Enthusiasts searched for them. Record companies eventually reissued many of them. The scene expanded because remarkable music escaped the confines of private collections and reached crowded dance floors throughout Britain. The movement grew through dissemination rather than exclusivity. The ethical argument also fails to support the OVO principle. Illegal bootlegging should not be defended. Copyright deserves respect. Artists deserve fair reward. But these concerns point towards the use of legitimate media, not necessarily original media. Authorized reissues, licensed represses, and official digital releases all satisfy the ethical concern while avoiding the unnecessary restriction imposed by OVO. The attempt to defend OVO by appealing to copyright therefore confuses two entirely different questions. The ethics support legitimacy. OVO demands originality. Those are not the same thing. Ultimately, every generation inherits a choice. It may preserve Northern Soul primarily as a collector's culture, where participation increasingly depends upon acquiring rare artifacts. Or it may preserve it as a musical culture, where collecting remains honored, history remains respected, but the music itself remains central. I believe Northern Soul has always belonged first and foremost to the music. The records matter because they carry the music. The DJs matter because they introduce the music. The dancers matter because they give the music life. The community matters because it binds all three together. Collectors deserve admiration. Original vinyl deserves admiration. History deserves admiration. None of these propositions is in dispute. What is in dispute is whether admiration should become obligation. I believe it should not. There is room within Northern Soul for collectors who pursue rare originals with extraordinary dedication. There is room for OVO events that celebrate that tradition. There is room for DJs who choose to play only original pressings. There is equally room for DJs who use authorized reissues, licensed represses, and other legitimate formats to introduce extraordinary music to new audiences. These approaches need not compete. They can coexist. Indeed, they already do. The future health of Northern Soul will depend not upon enforcing uniformity, but upon preserving that diversity while remaining faithful to the culture's true purpose. For Northern Soul has never derived its greatness from cardboard sleeves, catalog numbers, or matrix stamps. Its greatness has always resided where it began, in extraordinary music, unforgettable dance floors, and the community formed whenever that music brings people together. If we truly love Northern Soul, our highest loyalty should therefore be neither to rarity nor to ritual, but to the music itself. For it was the music that created the culture. It is the music that sustains the culture. And, if we allow it, it is the music that will carry Northern Soul into the generations still to come.